There is a growing number of authoritarian governments using fear and intimidation tactics to silence exiles and diasporas who challenge their rule and are now living in countries overseas. A new Washington Post opinions essay takes an in-depth look at what's known as transnational repression and explores how people who fled their home countries to escape harassment are still subject to threats and violence in other foreign nations. Nate Schenkkan is the Director of Research Strategy at the nonprofit Freedom House and co-wrote that piece, and he joins me now. Welcome. Thanks very much for joining us, Nate. You and your colleague mentioned that transnational repression is not a new thing, but is becoming much more normalized. Explain to us a little more about how this phenomenon grew to what it is today.
Yes, what we mean when we say that transnational repression is becoming normalized is that since the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, a very prominent Saudi journalist, a Washington Post contributing columnist, there's been more attention to the idea that diasporas and exiles may be under threat. But despite that attention, there hasn't really been a grappling with the fact that there are so many countries doing this in so many places around the world. So in this study, we tried to understand who is doing what, where, and to whom. And we actually found that some 31 countries around the world are pursuing their exiles and diasporas in 79 different countries, host countries, as we call them, all over the world. And this is really an unprecedented understanding, we think, of something that's now a global phenomenon and that needs to be reckoned with by democracies.
So specifically, who are some of the people at most risk of being silenced by these governments?
Yes, in some cases, political dissidents, journalists, activists. Certainly, in many of these countries, political organizing or independent journalism is simply not allowed, and people who go abroad and continue to do these things are targeted for those activities specifically. In other cases, however, people are targeted simply for who they are. If you think of the campaign that China is running against the Uyghur population or has run for a very long time against Tibetans, these are also people who are targeted abroad, not because they may be engaged in political activities necessarily, but simply by virtue of their ethnic identity. And then in some other cases, like the case of Rwanda, which is a very important country in our study, the entire diaspora essentially is targeted because the government takes such a totalitarian approach to the issues of who is allowed to speak on behalf of the nation.
Well, technology plays a big role in all of this, both in helping those who are exiled and by serving authoritarian states. Nate, can you explain more about how repressive governments are using technology to their advantage?
Absolutely. Technology is definitely a very big part of it. And it runs both ways. So in our common age, exiles, diasporas, journalists, activists, when they go abroad, they can reach back to their countries through Facebook, through WhatsApp, through Telegram, through all the tools that we use to stay in touch with each other, they use to stay in touch with their home country. But of course, their governments reach back to them as well. And they reach back through those tools. They reach back with harassment, with threats, but also with spying. In some cases, they use the open source information that's generated by those tools in order to track them and monitor them. So you see people using network analysis and other forms of very common software to analyze the ties between groups and to understand them and then to break them down. But you also see more sophisticated forms of what really amounts to spyware. So custom built applications that are sold, often on an open market, to these governments, and that they can then use to hack into particularly the phones and the other devices of these individuals. And once you've hacked into those phones or other devices, as you know, there's so much information about us, there's so much of our communications that lives on those devices in this age that you can really control and understand a person's life. And so a lot of this does take place through technology, unfortunately, and seems to be exacerbated by it.
Well, in the piece, you write that stopping cross-national harassment is not only a moral imperative, it is also a matter of self-interest for the United States and its own citizens. But, Nate, are there any consequences or punishments for states that do engage in transnational repression?
Consequences right now are inconsistent when they are applied. In some cases, we've seen the expulsion of diplomats. We've seen in limited cases the application of targeted sanctions. This especially pertains to the Russian case. Russia has committed a number of very high-profile assassinations in Europe, especially in the last 10 years. And there has been some response to that, but it's been inconsistent and it's been slow and it hasn't been applied evenly. So Saudi Arabia, for instance, has not really faced consequences for what has been a very well-documented case of transnational murder. And that's a very important gap. It shows an inconsistency around our ability to reckon with people doing really the worst crimes overseas, murders, kidnappings. And so if we want to take it seriously, if we want to stop the problem, we have to be willing to apply those consequences and accountability regardless of who is perpetrating the act.
Really sobering to hear. Nate Schenkkan. Nate, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.